Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. Now, when you look around this wonderful museum, you will see, or have seen, in various display cases, old toy soldiers. And when you go to the shop, you will see new toy soldiers. And basically, this talk is about British toy soldiers, from the old toy soldiers, as in the display cases, to the new toy soldiers, as in the shop. I myself am not a toy soldier collector or dealer. I'm just a historian who's interested in toy soldiers as a part of our history. The toy soldiers I'll be talking about are mostly the little 54mm, that's about 2¼ inches, 1/32 scale figures like this one. Probably those of you at the back can't see them, but anyway. And I hope that for some of you, this talk may be a sort of trip down memory lane. Now, of course, the subject of toy soldiers is not important history. It's not in any way as important as the history you normally get here. And it would be absurd to try to argue that it was. But, I suggest, toy soldiers are of some historical significance and, I hope, of some interest. Now, if you look up there, you can see the sort of classic image of British toy soldiers, say the 1930s or whatever, Highlanders, nice red coats, glossy paint, etc., etc., and behind them a nice wooden fort. Unfortunately, the image isn't quite what it seems, because these are actually Chinese replicas made for collectors fairly recently. But it gives you, as I say, it does give the image, which I'm sure many of you remember, of the nice glossy painted toy soldiers. These are actually Camerons. Right, let's get going then. For over 100 years, from the 1880s, playing with toy soldiers was a part of British boyhood. In his memoirs, My Early Life, Winston Churchill wrote about the toy soldiers he had as a boy in the 1880s. Quote, "I had ultimately nearly 1,500. They were all of one size, all British. The toy soldiers turned the current of my life." End quote. In the same period, Churchill's contemporary G.M. Trevelyan and his brothers up north at Wallington Hall in Northumberland were wargaming with 3,800 toy soldiers. That's quite a lot of toy soldiers, isn't it? 3,800. Trevelyan, later of course the most famous historian of his generation, wrote in his autobiography that these war games influenced his history writing and enabled him to describe battles. And today, Wallington Hall is owned and run by the National Trust, and if you go up there, you can actually see the toy soldiers, not quite all of them, but a lot of them. Moving on, in the Edwardian period, one of the boys who played with toy soldiers was Basil Hart, later famous as Captain Sir Basil Liddell Hart, the controversial military pundit and historian. Liddell Hart wrote in his memoirs that, quote, "When playing with lead soldiers, I like to make the game as tactical as possible, manoeuvring them rather than arranging them or shooting them down." Other memoirs and autobiographies also tell of boys playing with their toy soldiers. You'll find this in the memoirs or autobiographies of Dennis Wheatley, of Graham Greene, of A.J.P. Taylor and others. And this also occurs in fiction, in the books by H.G. Wells, by E. Nesbit, by Saki, by Richmal Crompton, by Evelyn Waugh, by Kingsley Amis and others. And more recently, those who played with toy soldiers include His Royal Highness Prince Charles, Sir Max Hastings, Roy Hattersley, Clive James, and Professor Sir Hugh Strawn, Chichely Professor of History, of the History of War at Oxford University, and formerly a trustee of this museum. So all the evidence indicates that playing with toy soldiers was very widespread and normal for a long time. Yet, of course, there were always exceptions. Some boys just weren't interested, and some parents would not allow their children to have, quote, war toys. And that was obviously true with Quakers and other pacifists. In fact, war toys were a continued, if relatively minor, concern of the peace movement. For example, in March 1914, before the First World War, The National Peace Council, which was a sort of umbrella organisation of pacifist organisations, stated their, quote, grave objection to toy soldiers, and that the children's welfare exhibition at Olympia, they put on a display of, quote, peace toys with, quote, not miniature soldiers but miniature civilians, not guns but ploughs and the tools of industry. Next, let's look at the history of toy soldiers and a little bit about what's been written and published on them. Now, today, there's a lot available. In fact, if you go down in the shop, you'll see some of it. There's a lot available on toy soldiers. And today, the books, the articles, and the websites on toy soldiers are almost all by hobbyists, collectors, dealers, and experts from the flourishing international toy soldier collector community. Today, old toy soldiers, like old teddy bears, are very collectible, though incidentally they're much cheaper than teddy bears. The big money is in teddy bears. That's just by the way. Just to give you an example, slight digression, a 1904 cinnamon colour Stife teddy bear called Teddy Girl sold at Christie's for £110,000. No toy soldiers have ever sold for anything like that. Now, today, among the people who write on toy soldiers, the leading expert on British toy soldiers, the author of standard books, is Mr. James Opie. He is himself an enthusiastic collector. Over the years, he accumulated about 65,000 figures. Then he had to move house, so he slimmed down his collection to about 16,000. And Mr. Opie has made an entire successful career as a toy soldier expert, writing books and working for the leading auction houses, Phillips, Christie's, and Bonhams. Another writer on toy soldiers, and in fact really the odd one out because he's an academic historian, is Professor Kenneth Brown, who's Professor Emeritus at Queen's University Belfast. He's actually an economic historian. He's written books on the history of the toy industry, quite a depressing subject actually, and articles on toy soldiers in learned and academic journals. And in this lecture I draw with gratitude on the publications of Mr. James Opie, Professor Kenneth Brown, and others. Okay, let's look briefly at the history, the background of toy soldiers. The early history of toy soldiers can be traced back for centuries in different countries, different cultures. They're made in varied sizes and materials, in silver for princes, and in wood or metal for lesser mortals like us. Now, in the 1880s, which is where we're really starting in this talk, in the 1880s there was no significant manufacture of toy soldiers in Britain. Toy soldiers just weren't made here. There may have been the odd wooden toy soldier, but basically what we know of as toy soldiers just weren't made in this country. Toy soldiers were imported. They're imported from Germany and France, and mostly from Germany. And Winston Churchill's and G.M. Trevelyan's toy soldiers were in fact made in Germany. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Germany was the world's leading toy manufacturer and exporter. In Edwardian England, about half the toys sold were actually German imports. The leading German toy soldier manufacturer was Hayder of Dresden, and Hayder and other German toy soldiers were solid metal figures and relatively expensive. And this point about them being solid is quite significant, as you'll see in a moment. And this brings us to the biggest name in British toy soldier history, the firm of Brittons. I'm sure many of you, if not most of you, have heard of Brittons. Now, Brittons was a London family firm. It was started by William Britton Sr. His dates are 1831 to 1907. If you're interested, you can look online on the Dictionary of National Biography, and there's an article there about William Britton and his family. Now, William Britton Sr. was a skilled metal worker. He was a brass worker, and he came from Birmingham, which of course was a great metal working centre. He moved to London, he married a London girl, and he had a large family. They had 5 sons and 4 daughters. And probably from the 1860s, nobody seems to know quite for sure, William Britton Sr. started manufacturing toys. But the toys he manufactured were quite large clockwork toys. and other mechanical toys. He made a waltzing cowboy, a tea-drinking mandarin, all sort of clever little mechanical toys. And these were made at the Britton's family home, which was in Islington. And what I think one needs to emphasise was that this was very small scale. It was sort of workshop production, craftsman production. It wasn't a factory at all. It was very small scale. Then in 1893, a key date in our story, in 1893, William Britton Jr., who was the son of William Britton Sr., William Britton Jr., whose dates 1859 to 1933, made a crucial innovation which transformed the fortunes of the Britton's family firm and also transformed the manufacture of toy soldiers. William Britton, as I'm sure many of you already know, introduced hollow casting. Now, the method of casting might seem a mere nerdish technicality, but in fact it made a crucial difference. Now, hollow casting itself was not new. It had been used for various things, including dolls' heads. But its application to the manufacture of metal toy soldiers was new and revolutionary. That's James Opie's term for it, new and revolutionary. Now, in hollow casting, molten metal, a lead alloy, was poured into a handheld brass mould, and then it ran out and it left a hollow figure. Now, in theory it's very simple. In practice it's rather more difficult to do. In other words, the production of these toy soldiers was not by machines, it was by craftsmen. It was a whole lot of individual craftsmen, each with their handheld brass mould and a ladle of molten metal, etc., etc. And these individual craftsmen, skilled craftsmen, could do over 300 figures per hour. Quite a lot, 300 figures per hour. After the castings had been made, they were then painted by women in the factory. Later on they used outworkers, but in the early period the women were all in the factory. Now, hollow casting obviously used much less metal than solid casting. And therefore the hollow cast figures obviously cost much less to produce, and therefore obviously they could be sold at much lower prices than the imported German solid figures. And before the First World War they sold at very roughly half the price of the German figures. Moreover, Britain's soldiers were attractive. They were well modelled, they were well painted, they were usually accurate. There are odd sort of slip-ups where they got things wrong, but on the whole they were pretty accurate, and they were in a standard scale, which we've already mentioned, 1/32 scale, 54 millimeters, like this chap here. And this scale, in fact, was the scale of the then popular Gauge 1 model railway, which is quite large by modern standards. Now, Britain's first set came out in 1893. It was a box of lifeguards, 4 troopers, and an officer. And over the following years, this set was followed by an extensive range of sets, more and more and more, year after year. There were British, there were Indian, there were colonial and foreign, there were Arabs and Zulus, there were cowboys and Indians, very popular and very much a part of British boyhood for a long time, including when I was young. I mean, I had a wooden tomahawk, that's by the way. Anyway, the British Army sets included a variety of units, including, of course, the household troops, line infantry, Highlanders, and mountain artillery, and the Royal Army Medical Corps. The Royal Army Medical Corps came complete with ambulances, nurses, stretcher bearers, and recumbent bandaged wounded. Usually the bandage consisted of a sort of rather tasteful bandage round the head with just a little bit of red on it. But never corpses. Britain's and other British toy soldier manufacturers never made dead soldiers. Britain's also, of course, manufactured toy artillery guns, which fired projectiles and caps. These were in various sizes, ranging up to the big so-called 18-inch Howitzer, which, I'm told, fired a lead projectile with significant force. I've never actually seen one fired. In fact, today, when they're offered for sale in online auctions, it says specifically they're not for sale to children. Things have changed, of course. Mind you, in this period, children could actually buy guns. I mean, anybody could buy a gun. I mean, if you read Kipling, there's a Kipling story where they go out and buy, these children go out and buy a revolver. Anyway, that's by the way. So Britain's also manufactured vehicles, wagons, carts, etc. And Britons were remarkably successful. They ousted foreign imports, they dominated the home market, and they became the world's leading toy soldier manufacturer. And they retained their leading position until the end, at least the end of Holocaust toy soldier production in 1966, and arguably even longer, even after that, even you could argue today. Britons exported to the Empire, they exported to the United States, despite the fact that the United States had high protective tariffs. They exported to South America. In Argentina, they were very popular. In fact, in Argentina, the locals actually made sort of their own imitations of Britain's toy soldiers. And they even exported to Germany. They produced very large numbers. By 1910, about 200,000 per week. That's from Professor Brown, that figure. And according to James Opie, the total Holocaust production, that's from 1893 through to 1966, was about 1,000 million. And that is a lot. Now, let's look briefly at prices, just quickly. Britain's best quality models were sold in boxed sets. They were dark red cardboard boxes with attractive labels. And from 1893 to 1914, a box of 8 infantry or 5 cavalry cost a shilling or less at Gamages. I'll mention about Gamages in a moment. In 1933, a box cost 1 shilling and 7 halfpenny. And there were, of course, also much cheaper ranges. Also, Britons soon had competitors, rival manufacturers of Holocaust toy soldiers. Some of them people who had actually learnt about it by working as Britain's employees and then sort of slipped away and started up their own firm. And these rival firms included Raker, BMC, Jahilco, otherwise known as John Hill and Co. And that was Britain's main rival. Jahilco went right from the 1890s through to the 1960s. And later, of course, at Crescent, Timpo and others. And these produced figures as cheap or cheaper than Britain's, and presumably competition kept prices down. Now let's look at availability and retail. Toy soldiers were widely available in various retail outlets, including department stores and notably Gamages of Holborn. Yes, there we are. There's Gamages in all its glory. That's from their 1913 catalogue. Now, some of you may remember Gamages. It closed in 1972. It was demolished. There's absolutely no sign of it left, nothing at all. But it had been started back in 1878, started on a very small scale, just as a small shop, by the enterprising Mr. Albert Gamage. And it grew and grew and grew. From this one small shop, he kept taking more and more adjoining premises until it ends up like that. And by the 1890s, it was a leading London department store known as, quote, the People's Popular Emporium. It was much advertised and had a flourishing catalogue and mail-order business. Now, unlike other department stores, Gamages focused very much on men rather than on ladies, and it specialised in sports equipment, sports clothes, etc. It was quite a masculine pace in its early days. Gamages sold an amazing range of goods, including motor cars, billiard tables, 12-bore shotguns, and live alligators. And it also had a big and famous toy department. In 1893, in other words, when Britain started, Mr. Gamage, agreed to sell Britain's toy soldiers, and his store, as you see there, effectively became the launch pad for Britain's toy soldiers. In fact, Gamages displayed so many Britain's soldiers that they became known, at least according to their own publicity, as, quote, the Aldershot of the toy soldier world. Britain's toy soldiers were also sold in Woolworths. Woolworths, of course, an American firm, but in the UK from 1909. And by 1931, they had 444 branches. I'm sure most of you, like me, can remember the time wherever you seemed to go in England, whatever little town you landed up in, there'd be a Woolworths. So Britain's soldiers, and other toy soldiers, well, of course, were very widely available. they're attractive, they're affordable, and as I say, widely available. And arguably, supply had created demand. The fact that these were available made people want them. They also fitted what one might call the dominant image of war, especially before 1914, the rather glamorized, romantic image of war. The war put across in the media, including the Illustrated London News, the Graphic, the Navy and Army Illustrated, and in fiction, such as the works of G.A. Henty, and in displays such as the Royal Tournament, and later on the Aldershot Tattoo. Okay, let's look now at a bit more at Britons and their toy soldiers. Now, after their initial success, their production was for many years a mixture of continuity and innovation. First of all, the continuity. They continued throughout to produce such firm favourites as the Household Troops, the Royal Horse Artillery, Drums and Bugles of the Line, Highlanders and Mountain Artillery. These sets went on for years and years and years. I mean, some of them were still being made in the early 1960s, a very long shelf life, as it were. Yet Britons also, especially in the early years, responded to current events, to contemporary wars, by issuing topical sets. Right? In 1896, following the Jameson raid, or Jameson raid if you prefer, into the Transvaal, which was an absolute disaster, as I'm sure you all know, Britons issued their set, Dr. Jameson and the South African Mounted Infantry, with Dr. Jameson leading his troops into imprisonment, in fact, but that's by the way. Now, in 1898, they responded to the Spanish-American War in Cuba by issuing sets of American and Spanish troops. In 1898 also, following the famous charge of the 21st Lancers at Omdurman, Britons issued a set of 21st Lancers, quote, Heroes of Omdurman, in khaki Foreign Service uniforms. During the Boer War, Britons issued various Boer War troops, including both Boers and British, and including the famous City Imperial Volunteers, the CIV, and the Imperial Yeomanry, and the famous 4.7 naval gun on its land mounting. Okay, let's see if I can work this thing again. The point about this is that they were manufacturing an enormous range of sets by this date. Okay, we'll move on. There we have some more from Gamage's 1913 catalogue. Notice here you have got the Camel Corps. You've got the Egyptian Camel Corps there. You've got the Royal Army Medical Corps there. Red Indians at the top, sailors there. And this, of course, the interesting set, that's the mounted artillery. That set was very popular, it came in the 1890s, and it was still in production in the 1960s. It's a very nice little set. What you've got, for anybody who isn't familiar with it, are 4 mules and a gun, which you disassemble, you take it apart, and each part of the gun goes on 1 mule. So you've got 3 parts of the gun going on 3 mules, and then the 4th mule has the ammunition and the mounted officer. Not quite an accurate model, because the real ones, I mean, it disassembled into more parts than 3, but anyway, still a nice set. Okay, here we have some more, again, from Gamage's 1913 catalogue, mostly Britons on this page, not entirely. Notice at this date they're making a lot of stuff to go with their toy soldiers. There's guns, there's transport, there's tents, etc., etc. And what you've got, you can see the tents up there obviously. What you've got there is an interesting set, because the set was a set that comprised Britain's figures, but the set was actually put together by another firm and marketed by them. There you have the what it says, Army Service Corps Transport. What that is, of course, is the old General Service Wagon, the GS Wagon. And the GS Wagon was the basic transport of the British Army for a very long time, right from the 1860s through to mechanisation between the wars. And I'm sure you've all seen photographs of First World War with GS wagons heavily laden with stuff, often going through the mud, etc. But there we are. There is the, as I say, the General Service Wagon, the GS Wagon. Boy Scouts there, as I say, they did make some civilians. The Boy Scouts started in 1908. A lot of media interest in it, a lot of interest from boys as well, of course. Naval Landing Party with a gun there. more Boy Scouts there, more cavalry, that's the 21st Lancers yet again, and then that's advertising one of their big expensive sets there. Okay, moving on then. Now, during the First World War, Britons started to make munitions, but surprisingly, they continued to make toy soldiers quite late. You may remember the slogan, business as usual, which was used at the early stages of the war. And in fact, they continued their toy soldier production in the First World War up to 1916, and they introduced some specifically First World War models, including machine gunners, and they put their 21st Lancers into steel helmets, and they produced their biggest gun so far, the so-called 18-inch Howitzer, which I've already mentioned. They also, by the way, produced an exploding trench. But there were such protests over this, they quickly withdrew it. It's quite rare, but anyway. Okay, moving on to the interwar period. In the 1920s and 30s, Britons continued to manufacture their pre-war and wartime sets. So basically they have an enormous range, and this range keeps growing because they do drop a very few, but not many. And they introduced the Royal Air Force, the Royal Engineers pontoons, King's African rifles, and Royal Artillery gunners in khaki. And they belatedly modernised their field guns. Right up to this period, they'd still been using the old Victorian-style field guns. Topical again, in 1936, at the time of the controversial Abyssinian War, they made models of both Abyssinians and Italian troops. Later in the 1930s, at the time of rearmament, they made ARP figures, and in 1940 they actually made the Home Guard. It must have been one of the last figures they made before the war. Before they stopped production. Now, in 1941, Britain switched entirely to munitions productions. They totally stopped making toy soldiers for the duration. And this was basically the end of an era. It was the end of their huge pre-war range, which we've seen some of there. It was the end of the Boer War sets, the 17th Lancers, the 21st Lancers, the Yeomanry, the pontoons, the Royal Field Artillery gun teams, and many more. After the Second World War, Britons resumed toy soldier production successfully, but with far fewer sets than before the war. They reissued some pre-war sets, and they introduced a few new models, including more soldiers in battle dress. However, and this is, I find, slightly strange, in their post-war Holocaust production, Britons ignored the Second World War. They didn't do the Eighth Army, they didn't do any of the sort of specifically Second World War troops. Why this is, I don't know. Now, after the Second World War, British toy soldier production was very largely exported, especially to the United States. As you know, the British economy was in a bad way at that time, and the British government was desperate for dollars, and both Britons and their rival Jahilko were significant dollar earners. In fact, post-war, about 70% of Jahilko production was exported to the United States. I'm afraid I don't have figures for Britons. My guess is it could be about the same. Then, moving on, in the 1950s and 60s came a big change, the switch to plastic. It was gradually Britons made more and more plastic, fewer and fewer metal, and 1966, the end of Holocaust metal toy soldier production by Britons. It was the end of an era, obviously, and the era which had started, as we've seen, back in 1893 with Britton Jr. Now, I'd just like to say a tiny bit more about Britton's firm, just to sort of round off about Britton's. Now, Britton's had been a very successful family firm for 3 generations. But in 1978, when Mr. Dennis Britton, who is an interesting chap, he ran Britton's, roughly speaking, from the 1930s through to into the 1970s, with an interlude in the RAF when he was decorator. I think he had the DFC, but you could check that. Anyway, 1978, Mr. Dennis Britton retired, and there was no member of the family willing or able to take over. And so in 1984, the family sold the company. So 1984, Britain ceased to be run by Britain's family. After that, there have been various changes of ownership, and today the company is American-owned, manufactures in China. Sadly today, there's nothing or very little that's British about Britons. Now, looking back, in retrospect, one can see now that Britain's pre-1966 models were just part of what has been called the golden age of British toys, which included Meccano, Hornby trains, Dinkies, Corgis, Sutcliffe boats, Triang, Mammoth steam engines, and much else. And it's a belated tribute to the attractiveness and quality of those British toys that today they are so, quote, very collectible and in international demand. And this brings us to the question of why do adults collect toy soldiers? Of course, motivation is always a problem. Why does anybody do anything? You're never quite sure. But at least one can make a few suggestions. Now, probably, and this is very brief, probably most people collect toy soldiers, I think, for three reasons. That's in addition to what you might call their inherent attractiveness and interest. There is a double nostalgia, I think. There's a nostalgia for one's own childhood, boyhood, and then there is a nostalgia for when Britain was a great power with a great empire and a victorious army. And in addition to this double nostalgia, there is also the fascination of the miniature. People love miniature things, as you know, when you see this in dolls' houses, model trains, etc., etc. Okay, now to end up with, let's look briefly at what has happened since 1966, when they stopped making the traditional Holocaust toy soldiers. Now, the first thing that happened is they still make toy soldiers. They make them in plastic. You can still go in a toy shop and you can buy cheap toy soldiers, but a very, very limited range. Mostly, in fact, Second World War, and mostly made in China. I think almost all made in China. And there's nothing to go with them. Britons no longer make vehicles, they no longer make artillery. All you've got is just a few Second World War figures. Now, the second thing that's happened since 1966 is that toy soldiers have continued to be collected and to be very collectible. It's very much an international hobby, it's very big in the United States, and it has all the paraphernalia of such a hobby. There are experts, there are dealers, there are auctions, there are shows, books, magazines, societies, crooks, fakes, forgeries, etc. And of course, rare sets fetch high prices at auction. But it's a myth that all old toy soldiers are valuable. Most of them aren't. Now, the third development since 1966 is the production of what are called new toy soldiers. Now, new toy soldiers, strictly speaking, aren't toys at all. You're not allowed to sell them to children. These are toy soldier type, toy soldier scale figures made specifically for adult collectors. And this started only a few years after 1966. It started with a couple called the Scrobies in London. They made some figures in their flat, I think presumably the kitchen of their flat, and they took them down to their stall in Portobello Road and they sold them. And after this, there was a very rapid growth of what one could call a cottage industry, making toy soldiers for collectors. You needed very little capital. You could do it at home, you could do it in your shed or garage or whatever. And by 1991, there were or had been about 180 makers of these new toy soldiers. Most of them were small firms, they just came and went, and sadly, a lot more went than came, as it were. Anyway, today the leading firms making these toy soldiers for collectors are Britons, who belatedly came into the sector, and King & Country, which is a Hong Kong-based firm which actually manufactures in mainland China. Other firms include Tradition of London and Dorset Soldiers, which is Giles Brown's outfit down on Portland. And if you go into the museum shop, downstairs you can see, and you can buy if you feel inclined, figures by Britons, by King & Country, and by Tradition. But, as you may know, perhaps I should warn you, they are expensive. A single figure costs £20 or more, a mounted figure £80 or more, and sets even more than that. To take a few recent examples, a Britain's First World War 18-pounder and 4 men costs £130. The new Britain's Zulu War artillery gun team costs £500. And if you've still got plenty of money, the Britain's now gunboat costs £900. And they've got one downstairs, or at least when I last looked, they had one downstairs, so hurry, hurry and buy it. Anyway. Right. And moving on to pictures, this is just to show you some of the so-called new toy soldiers, the ones made for collectors. These are 1990s Britons. You'll notice various differences from the traditional toy soldiers. And just a couple of things to point out. The poses are much more, quote, realistic. There's more sort of action in them than the rather static poses of the old toy soldiers. Notice also the gun, which is a 4.5 Howitzer. This is not a toy gun anymore. They used to make toy guns which fired. By this time, when they're making them for collectors, they're making scale models. That's quite a nice scale model of the 4.5. And there we are, same set again. And you'll notice a limber in the background. The set actually comprises what you see there, a gun, a 4-man detachment, and a limber. But there's nothing to pull the limber. You have to provide your own horses if you want the limber to move, or notionally to move anyway. Okay, moving on. Now we come to the latest. This is the current Britons. And you'll notice quite a change from the earlier new toy soldiers, and particularly from the traditional toy soldiers. You notice, of course, very much more realistic, matte painted. This is obviously their desert series, their War Along the Nile, I think they call it. Basically, it's the Gorton Relief Expedition, etc. And there they are, very, very realistic, and as I said before, very expensive. There's about 400 quid's worth of figures there. Okay, moving on again, there we are, more the same. Very nice figures, but as I say, a different genre from the old toy soldiers. They don't look like old toy soldiers, they're not meant to look like old toy soldiers. Moving on, there are more of them. And you can see infantry in the background, of course. And there we are, we started with Highlanders. Our last picture there is a Highlander, Black Watch, of course, again from the Britain's Sudan War series. Okay, so it's an expensive hobby, buying these new metal toy soldiers. If you want to play or to war game with 1/32 scale figures, you do much better with Airfix. Airfix, of course, the famous kit production, famous maker of plastic kits. From the 1950s, they made plastic soldiers, unpainted plastic soldiers. From the 1970s, they made 1/32 scale figures. These are still available. You can buy them in the shop downstairs, and they're a lot cheaper. You can get 2 boxes, 28 figures, for less than the price of a single metal toy soldier. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's it. Thank you for listening.